Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm your host, Father Nathan Castle. Last week's episode was an introduction to Clare and Celie, the Stewardess. When it's time to write one of these books, I'm in the process right now of doing the third one, and part of the discernment is which stories that we have on file, and there are lots of them, uh, which would be the most helpful to those who receive it, whether they listen to it or read it or hear about it on a podcast. The story of Clare and Celie, it made the cut in our lives, and we asked the Holy Spirit to be part of the choosing of those stories. This one is just very dear to me, and I'll summarize it briefly because we did discuss it in the previous podcast. If you missed that, you can always go back and find it. But the long and short of it was that the dream that I received had me being somebody that was elderly and infirm. I think I wasn't sure of gender, but I had a sense that I was elderly and infirm and in my own home, dozing, when there was an unusual sound at the door. I was a little confused because I had had a fall that had resulted in some broken or cracked ribs. Neighbors were particularly solicitous about bringing meals and checking on me, but I wasn't expecting anybody, and they usually call ahead. In the dream, I looked toward the door and found that there were a couple of people, a man and a woman, really barging in, letting themselves in, people I didn't know, and they looked frightening. In the dream, that's about all I got. The way that it played out, the woman, it was a woman, her name is Clare. She explained that she was a Christian woman. Maybe that was for my benefit because I'm a priest. Sometimes they do that. And that she was normally a church-going Christian woman, but in her infirmity, it had gotten to be too difficult to do that, and that she mostly had her own devotional life at home. When this home invasion happened, she says, I tried to rouse myself and defend my home. Well, you can kind of get a picture in your head of an elderly woman, frail, getting up from off the couch, having been dozing, trying to rouse herself. And she said, the man pushed me, I fell down, and that's all it took. She said, I left my body almost right away. I was brought between the space between my roof and the canopy of trees over it. I was with my guardian. She said, I really wasn't that aware of him, except I didn't have trouble believing I had one. It's just something I hadn't paid attention to. But she said, he was in charge of me and he was very helpful. He said, I want you to pretend that you're a dog that's just gone swimming. I want you to shake off everything that just happened. And she followed his directions. Then he said, I just love this line. Let's get out of here. It's unpleasant. You know, the place where you were just murdered in your home is unpleasant. Let's leave, he said. And he offered to have her get on his back. Her first thought was it reminded her of something she'd seen on television about tandem skydiving, about entrusting yourself to be strapped to someone and jump out of a plane. And she said, I would never in my life have done that. But it was like she said, I didn't have a better offer at the time. It was kind and it made sense. And so I did it. And she was brought to a place where she was well cared for. One thing that that stood out in my mind is she said, I would never have thought being killed in one's own home could be so easy. And I thought, well, that might be reason enough to include it in a book, because there might be people who are left behind and left to wonder what it was like for my loved ones in their final moments, or where have they gone since, or whatever, when something so dreadful happens. Anyway, in the end, people come to us and our little team. They presented a dream. Then I get with prayer partners. We go into protected prayer. And my guest and I have just finished protected prayer in advance of this interview. We go into protected prayer. I allow my voice to be borrowed momentarily for the person to explain themselves. Claire did a really nice job of explaining what happened to her, and do it in a way that even though it was describing something awful, it just had truth and almost a lightheartedness or a sense of surprise. She's somebody that I'd really like to know better when I pass. But anyway, when it came time for her to cross, we asked, who would you like to have come for you? Do you know anyone who has died before you did, who you know loved you? And she came back with the reply, it'd be my sister, Cecilia Marie or Cecilia Ann. I don't remember what the middle name was. We just called her Celie. And she died a young woman. I've been talking to her photograph for the last 40 years. If anybody was going to come for me, I'd like it to be her. And then after a moment's pause, she said, oh my God, look at that. Look, she looks like a little tart. Kind of quaint language that I think only an elderly person would use. She looks like a little tart. Well, it turns out that she had wanted to be a stewardess back in the early 50s when they looked like little tarts, when they all had to be thin, have a tight belt around their waist, the little epaulets on the shoulder that made them look like they were a pilot or something. She had to walk up a series of steps the way you do on a tarmac in a small airport, or the way they all worked back in the 50s or 60s, early 60s. And she had a tray with an umbrella drink at the top. So she was letting her sister know, we're going to have a little girl trip, and you're going to be in first class, and I'm going to be the stewardess I never got to be. So she just said, it's just girls having a little bit of fun. So isn't it extraordinary to take a story like that, have it end up being girls having a little fun? Well, that I told that story on someone else's podcast. This podcast has only been in existence for about 8 months now. It was before this podcast existed, but I was guesting on another podcast. I think it was coming from Connecticut. A person on the other end of the country heard it, and she's our guest today. So I think I've talked enough. Today, you have a screen name. You want to tell us your screen name?
My screen name is Peaceful Hiker.
Well, Peaceful Hiker. You and I have become friends in the since we first met a long while ago now. But would you take it away? Tell us anything you want to tell us.
Thank you for having me on your podcast, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today. I think a little background would be helpful. I was raised in the Catholic tradition, and as a family, we would go to Mass together every Sunday. And then, as a special treat, we used to get donuts after Mass. And then, as I grew up, I attended college and studied accounting. I married my husband. And what's interesting is your best friend married us. We didn't know each other, but your best friend married us about almost 40 years ago.
Yes.
I enjoy hiking. And about a year ago, I became an oblate of the Benedictine order. I think it's really important to understand that I live a very ordinary life.
Define an oblate.
Oblates are just everyday people from various faith traditions who commit to the role of Saint Benedict and the contemplative practices of Benedictine spirituality.
And many viewers, not all, would know that I'm a Dominican, which we're another different religious order from the Benedictines, and we Dominicans also have a lay group associated with us. They don't use the word oblate; they just are called lay Dominicans. Those kind of organizations allow anyone who wants to be a part to kind of be studied and tutored into the prayer practices of members of those orders.
I'd like to share my story today. I heard you speaking on a podcast. It really intrigued me because I lost my mom and my dad and my brother in an in-home invasion. Just listening to your podcast, I decided to purchase the books. They were very, very helpful. When I reflect on it, it still triggers me. So I'm going to push through. My family, we continued to go to Mass together. And after Mass, we're not getting donuts. Now we're going out to lunch and we're getting pastries. This particular Sunday, we've gone to Mass and we've gone out to lunch. And it's the last time I see my mom and my dad and my brother. A few hours later, they are killed in an in-home invasion. I'll find them a few days later. I call 911 and all these helpers from the sheriff's department and emergency medical services show up. I'm in a state of shock and time slows down and I'm shaking uncontrollably. Even today, when I start thinking about it, I start shaking again because it's so traumatic.
Hmm.
But this very kind EMT arrives and he turns to me and he pulls out this Michael the Archangel coin from his pocket and he looks at me and he tells me, I'm here for you too. And in that moment, I realized that even in our darkness, God is still with us. And as I move through the trauma, it's a message that I need to hear repeatedly. It's as if the trauma it's hard to remember the good when you've seen something really, really bad.
Yes.
About a year after my family passes away, I have a visitation dream. A visitation dream is very distinct and a clear dream. It's compared to my normal dreams. My normal dreams don't make a whole lot of sense. I say it's because they originate from the basement of my subconscious. The visitation dream has a very different feel. I don't know if do your dreams have a different feel?
Some years ago, started using specific language about them. I say that I have a dream if it's about my own psyche, whatever it is that your subconscious state is doing in the night with your dreams. I have a dream. When I have one of these other ones that are the subject of these books, I say I'm receiving a dream. It's other people's data and it comes to me and I receive it, which is different from it originating inside of me.
That makes perfect sense to me.
So you had a visitation dream that felt like you received it rather than it originated within you. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
Okay.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. And in that dream, my mom and dad are present. It's my dad who speaks. And my mom is in the background at this table, and there's all these maps covering the table. But it's my dad who's kind of standing in front of the table, and he's the one that's talking to me. He tells me that I'm in good hands. He can go now. And I ask him, I say, well, where are you going? Because I didn't want him to leave. He told me he was helping souls get from here to there. I couldn't imagine anybody needing more help at the time than me. I couldn't
Mm.
believe that he was going. And I was like, well, who are these people, right? That are so important. And he said that they were the children of his friend. That was all the follow up questions I got. And then he tells me that I'll be okay. When I wake up, I'm just flooded with peace and really with this understanding that, yeah, you are going to be okay. Everything, it's going to be fine. Fast forward almost 6 years later, I was listening to you on a podcast. I was cleaning my kitchen. I like to listen to podcasts when I clean. It makes it go so much faster. You were discussing your Afterlife Interrupted Helping Souls Cross book, and you mentioned that you were the discharge staff in a hospital for souls who were ready to cross. The idea that souls received help crossing sounded familiar. After my dream, I bought your books and I just absolutely I love reading your books. I love learning from them. They've been very instrumental in my healing process. But the story that hit home was Claire's. When Claire, guardian angel Ernie, arrives and pulls her out really quickly and has her shake off the ugliness, that was very important for me to hear. It gave me a great sense of relief. I was able to sleep. It was the first good night of sleep that I had in almost 6 years. I used to wear this watch and it would tell me, it would give me like a number and a color and like my sleeping habits were, it was kind of like in the C range or like the yellow range. And then when I wore that watch all the time. Then I read the book, and that night it was like in the high 80s, and my watch was green, and I was so excited. That's why I I emailed you because I was so thankful to finally have a good night's sleep.
Well, I remember that email very well. Part of the discernment that my team and I do when we choose to tell stories, remember too that none of these stories are shared publicly until we go back to them one more time and ask their permission to use their story. That's important. Um, but when we choose these stories, or when sometimes the stories seem to kind of choose us, you know how that works. Um, we one of the things we wanted to be most careful of was, could this story be wounding? And because all of them involve people that died a sudden violent death, any of their loved ones could be very delicate. Hard enough to lose a loved one when there's an illness that precedes the death that warns everybody that the time is coming or whatever. But when it's so abrupt, and especially at the hand of another, move very cautiously, and we had with that one. So when I got your email, I prayed about making sure that however I replied didn't wound you anymore. Do you remember that?
Absolutely. I was surprised I heard from you. I know how busy priests are, and I can only imagine how busy authors are. I just kind of wanted to send out this email full of gratitude, really not expecting to hear anything. And then you emailed me back and asked if I had some time to chat. And I absolutely, we kind of exchanged pleasantries and visited and identified that you're a good friend of yours married us and we had never met. You actually had dinner at my family's house, unbeknownst to me. I absolutely remember that conversation. And what really helped me was when you said that I was loved beyond all measure. I remember still feeling really abandoned and lost. The trauma was so great that I kept on forgetting that God is still present. And so when you told me that I was loved beyond all measure, it was this shift in perspective. I had to think about it. I had to look back and see really how was God presenting or how was God there. But I was so focused on my loss, I wasn't seeing how God was present. So when the EMT arrived and everything was very, very dark, and he pulled out the Michael, the Archangel coin, that was, I'm still here. You're not alone. And yeah, I remember that conversation.
Well, I didn't know that part about the EMT. We've talked about different things, but even that, well, first of all, let's go back just a little bit because that little disclosure that I had actually met your family deserves at least a little bit of conversation. I only met them once. I was a guest in their home for dinner,
That's
and
right.
um, and that was, so that was maybe a couple of hours out of a lifetime. But that was kind of extraordinary that our paths had crossed. So that's one thing. But then the other one, even to tell a person who I didn't know very well, I'm talking about you, who had contacted me via email, and with all that happened to your family and to you, even for a clergy person to say, remember that you're so thoroughly loved, that can sound like cheap grace. You know what I mean?
Well, exactly. Well, I thought you were crazy when you told me that. And it took a while. Like, it does sound like cheap grace. And I had to think about it. And and I think it, but I do think it's important because it helps shift my perspective from what I had lost to what still remained.
Yeah, and yours was so tragic. It was three deaths at once in a violent way at the hands of another. But lots of us suffer heartbreak of one kind or another and can feel for a while like we are abandoned, and that if you're a believer in God, that God doesn't love me, or God forgot about me, or God didn't care, um, all of those things. And it's still, I mean, I've been in trauma centers a lot, you know. I've been first on the scene to a suicide because the family called me there before they even called the police. It's not that I haven't been around some things, but I just believe that God is love and God's loving all the time. And you have to kind of pick your spots to be that explicit about it. But I did take that chance with you and say, don't forget, in the middle of everything else that you're going through, God's love hasn't gone away or disappeared.
I'm grateful that you did share with me or you took that risk because I can imagine the response wouldn't always be very nice. It's difficult in the middle of grief and suffering and loss to pull yourself out of that and remember that God still loves you.
Part of the reason I was excited to have you on my podcast was that you speak with authority like few people I know.
Thank you.
You and I talked offline. The little format that we created for doing these stories was to break them into three parts, to tell the story, basically like I did last week. And then we decided to go into what we call compassionate response from people who let us know how hearing of that story affected them, which that's exactly you. And then a third session on what we call spiritual practice, something from the Catholic Christian tradition that I'm schooled in, that I've lived in for my life, how something that we do might be available to people that don't know about it. But for now, that's it for today. If you'd like to be in touch with me, you can do that through my website, nathan-castle.com. I'd love to hear from you. God bless you. Bye-bye. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Joyful Friar. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. If you'd like to support this podcast, you can make a donation by clicking the donate button. See you next time. God bless.